My daughter left a neon yellow note on the mahogany kitchen counter of our Martha's Vineyard estate. It said, "I'm done with you. This house is sold. Pack your things and make room for real people who actually have a future." I didn't argue. I didn't beg for mercy or remind her that I was the one who paid for her Ivy League degree while fighting a chronic lung condition. I simply flipped that hateful piece of paper over and wrote just 2 words. Hours later, while the Atlantic wind howled against the cliffs, my phone exploded with 49 missed calls, frantic voicemails, and apologies dripping with panic. But by then, the fuse was already lit. Those 2 words weren't a plea for help, they were a death warrant for her lifestyle. Hello everyone. Before we dive into the fallout of this betrayal, leave a comment below and let me know which city you are watching from, so I can welcome you to our community. And a quick reminder, this story contains dramatized elements for storytelling and educational purposes, but the lesson about protecting your legacy is as real as it gets. I am Arthur Vance. I spent 40 years designing the very piers and seawalls that protect this island from the ocean's rage. I built a multi-million-dollar empire from a single drafting table, and I bought this estate with cash 30 years ago. It was my sanctuary, the place where I raised my family, and where I watched my late wife take her last breath. I thought my daughter, Lillian, was my rock during my recent surgery. I thought she was helping me manage my affairs while I recovered. I never imagined she was actually measuring the drapes for a quick sale and scouting out the cheapest state-run nursing homes to dump me in. But as the rain began to lash against the windows of my own home, I realized I wasn't a father to her anymore. I was just an asset to be liquidated. The freezing rain of Martha's Vineyard lashed against my face as I stood trembling on the porch, my key scraping uselessly inside the deadbolt. I jiggled the handle, thinking the coastal salt had finally seized the mechanism, but the digital keypad above the brass handle blinked a mocking crimson. Access denied. I punched in my birthday, then my late wife's, then the date I bought this house 30 years ago. But the result was the same red flash of rejection. I hammered my fist against the heavy oak door, the vibration rattling my weakened chest until a coughing fit forced me to double over. "Lillian, open this door," I croaked, my voice barely audible over the crashing surf and the howling wind. A shadow flickered behind the frosted glass, and for a heartbeat I felt a surge of relief, assuming my daughter was simply playing a cruel, childish prank. The heavy bolt finally slid back, but the door only opened a few inches, held fast by the security chain I had installed myself for her protection years ago. Lillian peered through the gap, her eyes devoid of the warmth she usually displayed when she needed a check signed. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and she held a glass of my finest vintage scotch. "Arthur, what are you doing back here?" she asked, her tone flat and clinical, as if I were a telemarketer interrupting her dinner. I stared at her, stunned by the coldness in her voice and the way she refused to unhook the chain. "What am I doing?" "I live here, Lillian. I just got back from the clinic and I'm soaked to the bone. Let me in before I collapse on my own doorstep." I tried to push against the wood, but she leaned her weight against it, blocking my entry with a calculated firmness. "You don't live here anymore, old man," she said, her lip curling into a sneer that made my blood run colder than the Atlantic rain. "We talked about this. Your condition is a liability, and this house is far too much for you to manage. Jeffrey and I accepted a cash offer this morning. The new owners want immediate possession, and honestly, you're just in the way." "Accepted an offer? You can't sell my house. It belongs to me," I shouted, the rage finally warming my limbs. Behind her, in the warm glow of the foyer, I saw Jeffrey, my son-in-law. Ong was leaning against the staircase, checking his gold watch and smirking as if my desperation was a comedy show staged for his amusement. He didn't offer to help. He simply signaled for Lillian to finish the job. "Technically, you signed the power of attorney last month, remember?" she corrected sharply, her voice rising to drown out my protests. "You told us to handle your affairs while you focused on getting better. Well, we are handling them. We've found a nice, affordable facility for you on the mainland. It's called Sunset Manor. They deal with people in your state every day. Sunset Manor is a warehouse for the dying, Lillian. You're throwing me away like trash." I gripped the doorframe, my knuckles white. "I'm managing your assets, Arthur. Now, get off the property before I call the police for trespassing. This isn't your sanctuary anymore. It's our payday." She slammed the door shut, and the click of the lock sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the night. The neon sign of the Edgartown gas station buzzed with an irritating hum that seemed to vibrate inside my throbbing skull. I sat in the back of a yellow taxi, shivering in my damp wool coat, while the windshield wipers scraped rhythmically against the glass. The driver, a young man with tired eyes, watched me through the rearview mirror with a mixture of pity and suspicion as I reached into my inner pocket. I pulled out my black metal Visa Infinite card, a symbol of a lifetime of architectural success, and handed it through the plastic partition. $60 for the ride from the cliffs, sir, the driver muttered, swiping the card through his handheld terminal. I waited for the familiar beep of approval, the sound that usually cleared my path through the world without a second thought. Instead, a harsh, mechanical buzz filled the cramped car. Declined, the driver said, handing the card back with a frown. Maybe the chip is wet from the rain? Try it again. I wiped the card on my sleeve, my fingers trembling so violently I nearly dropped it. I knew there was over $500,000 in that checking account alone. I had just received a dividend payment from the Harbor Project last week. He swiped it again, slower this time, but the screen flashed a message that made my blood run colder than the Atlantic. Pickup requested. Contact issuing bank. Look, man, I don't want any trouble, the driver said, his voice hardening as he shifted the taxi into park. Do you have cash or another card? I can't let you out until I get paid. I dug through my wallet, bypassed the empty slots where my backup American Express used to sit, and found a crumpled $20 bill and some loose change. It was a pathetic sight. Arthur Vance, the man who designed the structural bones of this island, was reduced to counting nickels in the back of a cab at 3 a.m. I handed him the 20 and my gold watch, a vintage Patek Philippe that was worth more than his entire fleet of cars. Keep the watch as collateral, I whispered, my voice raspy from the cold. I just need to use your phone. Mine was disabled. He took the watch, his eyes widening as he realized it was genuine, and handed me his rugged smartphone. I dialed the priority service number for my private bank, a line I had used for 20 years. After 5 minutes of agonizing elevator music, a woman named Jennifer answered. Mr. Vance, I see a flag on your entire profile, she said, her professional warmth replaced by a hesitant chill. A wire transfer for the full balance of your checking and savings accounts, $640,000, was authorized this afternoon by your designated agent, Jeffrey Dunn. He provided the durable power of attorney you filed last month. The accounts are currently at zero, and all credit lines have been closed per his request due to suspected cognitive decline on your part. Cognitive decline. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. I remembered that afternoon in the hospital, barely 48 hours after my lung surgery. I was high on morphine and struggling to breathe when Jeffrey walked in with a stack of papers. He told me it was just a standard insurance update for my retirement protection, a way to ensure the bills were paid while I recovered. I trusted him because Lillian was standing right behind him, nodding with tears in her eyes. I had signed my own financial death warrant while gasping for air. Thank you, Jennifer, I said, hanging up before she could offer a hollow apology. I stepped out of the taxi and into the biting wind, watching the taillights disappear. I stood alone under the buzzing neon lights, clutching a trash bag of damp clothes and exactly $12 in change. They hadn't just taken my house. They had erased my identity. But as I stared at the dark silhouette of the ferry terminal in the distance, a cold, hard clarity began to settle over me. Jeffrey thought he was playing with a confused old man, but he had forgotten that a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous architect in the world. The brass plaque on the weathered brick building in Vineyard Haven read Beatrice Thorne and Associates. I stood before the heavy oak door at 5 a.m, my knuckles raw from the cold as I hammered against the wood. Beatrice was more than just a lawyer. She was the woman who held my late wife's hand during her final hours, and the only person on this island who knew the true extent of the Vance family holdings. When the porch light finally flickered on, a woman with silver hair and eyes as sharp as a falcon's peered through the side window. She didn't gasp or offer a hollow greeting. She simply unlatched the deadbolt and pulled me into the warmth of her office, which smelled of old parchment and expensive tobacco. You look like a man who has been haunted by ghosts, Arthur, she said, wrapping a heavy wool blanket around my shivering shoulders. She didn't ask why I was soaked or why I was carrying my life in a plastic trash bag. She went straight to the kitchenette and poured me a double shot of bourbon, her expression hardening as she watched me drain the glass in a single gulp. Lillian and Jeffrey. They've locked me out, Bea, I managed to say, my voice cracking under the weight of the betrayal. They sold the house. They emptied the accounts. Jeffrey used a power of attorney I signed while I was practically hallucinating in the recovery room. Beatrice didn't offer sympathy. She sat behind her massive mahogany desk and opened a heavy leather-bound file. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, her face illuminated by the pale blue glow of the monitor as she accessed the county's real estate registry and the private banking portals she had monitored for decades. For 20 minutes, the only sound in the room was the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rhythmic clicking of her mouse. "It's worse than a simple sale, Arthur," she finally whispered, turning the screen toward me. "Jeffrey didn't just sell the estate. He used the power of attorney to execute a quitclaim deed, transferring the title to a shell company called Dunn Development Holdings, an entity he controls. Then, he took out a private equity loan against the property for $2,400,000. I leaned forward, squinting at the digital documents. The interest rate on the loan was predatory, nearly 18%. It wasn't a standard bank mortgage. It was a high-risk bridge loan from a firm known for aggressive foreclosures. Jeffrey wasn't just stealing the equity. He was gambling with the very foundation of my life. "He's in deep with a group of offshore crypto speculators," Beatrice continued, her voice dripping with professional disdain. "He lost over $3 million in a botched, leveraged trade last month. He didn't sell your house to give you a better life, Arthur. He sold it to keep himself out of a federal prison for wire fraud. And Lillian, she's listed as the primary witness on every single one of these fraudulent documents. They think I'm a dying old man with a foggy brain," I said, a slow, cold fire beginning to burn in my gut, replacing the damp chill of the rain. "They think I'll just fade away in some state-funded facility while they fly off to Paris on my life's work." Beatrice leaned back, a predatory smile touching her lips, the same smile she used when she dismantled opposing counsels in the Massachusetts Superior Court. She reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and pulled out a sealed, wax-stamped envelope that I hadn't seen in over 10 years. "They forgot one very important thing, Arthur," she said, tapping the envelope. "Your wife, Eleanor, was much more cynical than you ever were. She knew Jeffrey was a vulture from the moment Lillian brought him home for Thanksgiving. She created a safety net that even a durable power of attorney cannot touch. It's time we open the Silver Lining Trust." The grandfather clock in Beatrice's office struck 6, its chime echoing through the room as she broke the wax seal on the envelope Eleanor had prepared a decade ago. Inside was a single high-security hardware token and a series of alphanumeric codes written in my wife's elegant, cursive script. I sat before the high-resolution monitor, my pulse steadying for the first time in 48 hours. While Jeffrey was busy raiding my domestic checking accounts, he had no idea that the real crown jewels of the Vance legacy were buried in a Tier 1 private bank in Zurich, shielded by a living trust that only triggered in the event of my medical incapacity or a proven breach of fiduciary duty by my heirs. "Eleanor was always 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room," Beatrice whispered, her fingers dancing across the encrypted login screen. She inserted the hardware token, and after a series of biometric scans, the screen blossomed with a balance that made my domestic losses look like pocket change. $4,700,000 in liquid assets, plus a diversified portfolio of gold bullion and blue-chip international stocks. "Jeffrey thinks he's a shark because he stole $600,000 from a sick man," I said, a grim smile finally touching my lips. "He doesn't realize he just jumped into an ocean with a leviathan. Arthur, the bridge loan Jeffrey took out against your estate is held by a firm called Harborside Capital," Beatrice explained, her professional focus narrowing. "It's a predatory lender that specializes in flipping distressed assets. They don't want the interest. They want the title to your Martha's Vineyard property so they can subdivide it into luxury condos. If they don't get their $2,400,000 by Monday, they will initiate an emergency foreclosure. Then we won't give them until Monday," I replied, leaning into the light of the monitor. "Beatrice, I want you to initiate an immediate buyout of that debt. Not a repayment, but an acquisition. Use the Zurich funds to offer Harborside Capital a 10% premium on the principal if they assign the entire lien and the underlying promissory note to the Eleanor Vance Memorial Trust by the end of business today." Beatrice looked at me with a mixture of shock and admiration. "You're not just saving the house, Arthur. You're becoming Jeffrey's new creditor. If you own the note, you own him." "Exactly," I said, my voice hardening. "He thinks he's selling my house to a nice young couple tomorrow morning. He thinks he's going to walk away with $1 million profit after paying off his crypto debts. But when he sits down at that closing table, he won't be looking at a buyer. He'll be looking at the man who holds the leash to his entire financial future." For the next 3 hours, the office was a hive of silent, high-stakes activity. Beatrice coordinated with the Swiss bank and the legal department at Harborside Capital, her voice a calm, lethal weapon over the encrypted phone line. By 9 in the morning, the digital ink was dry. The Eleanor Vance Memorial Trust was now the sole lien holder of the Vance estate. I was no longer a victim of a fraudulent sale. I was the unseen architect of the trap that was about to snap shut on my own daughter's greed. I stood up, the fatigue in my bones replaced by a cold, calculating energy. The storm outside had cleared, leaving the island in a crisp, deceptive calm, much like the one I was about to shatter. The moon hung low over the Vineyard Haven shoreline, casting long, jagged shadows across the salt-crusted dunes as I stepped out of Beatrice's car. I didn't approach the front gates where the security cameras would flag my presence. Instead, I moved toward the overgrown perimeter of the northern seawall I had designed 40 years ago. Hidden behind a massive granite boulder was a rusted iron grate, the entrance to an old drainage tunnel that led directly into the reinforced foundation of the estate. My lungs burned with every ragged breath, but the cold adrenaline of a man reclaimed from the dead pushed me forward through the narrow, damp passage. I emerged into the crawl space beneath my private woodworking shop, the smell of sawdust and cedar, a bittersweet reminder of a life I thought I had lost. I climbed the internal ladder I had built for structural inspections, my hands finding the familiar grooves of the trapdoor. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved like a ghost through the shadows of my lathes and bandsaws, reaching the heavy oak door that connected the shop to the main house. I pressed my ear against the wood, the sound of laughter and clinking crystal drifting from the dining room above. To Paris, and to the death of the old guard, Jeffrey's voice echoed, thick with the arrogance of a man who believed he had won. I heard the distinct pop of a champagne cork, a bottle of my 1996 Krug that I had been saving for my 75th birthday. "I can't believe it was that easy, Jeff," Lillian added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The lawyer at the closing firm said the wire transfer will clear by 11 in the morning. We'll be at Logan Airport by 3, and by the time the state authorities realize the Sunset Manor fees haven't been paid, we'll be eating croissants in the Marais." "What about your father?" Jeffrey asked, though there was no concern in his tone. "The nursing home intake form says he needs a specialized ventilator by Tuesday. If the insurance is canceled, they'll just dump him in a county ward." "He's 72, Jeffrey. He's lived a full life," she replied with a chilling lack of emotion. "He had his time in the sun. Now it's our turn to shine with the $2,400,000 from this sale. I'm tired of playing the grieving daughter to a man who refuses to just fade away. He was a great engineer once, but now he's just an obstacle to our happiness." I reached into my pocket and activated the high-definition recording app on my smartphone. Every word of their conspiracy, every callous remark about my death, and every detail of their plan to abandon me in a state ward was being captured in digital stone. They weren't just selling my house. They were orchestrating my quiet execution to fund a luxury escape. "I already booked the one-way tickets on Air France," Jeffrey bragged, the sound of him pouring more wine filling the silence. "First class, of course. We'll leave the Range Rover at the terminal and never look back at this freezing rock. By the time Arthur realizes he's homeless, we'll be ghosts." I stood in the darkness of my workshop, clutching my phone as if it were a weapon. My daughter was willing to let me rot in an indigent ward for a few years of champagne and French boutiques. The betrayal was no longer a financial wound. It was a total severance of our shared humanity. I didn't feel sadness anymore. I felt a cold, surgical resolve. They thought they were ghosts, but as I retreated back down the ladder into the foundation of my home, I knew I was the one who held the keys to their cage. Tomorrow morning at 9, the closing meeting wouldn't be their grand escape, it would be their final reckoning. The conference room of Sterling and Hightower sat on the highest floor of a glass tower overlooking the Vineyard Haven harbor, a space designed to intimidate anyone who couldn't afford the $1,000 an hour view. I stood in the hallway, adjusting the silver cufflinks of my charcoal wool Armani suit, a garment I hadn't worn since Eleanor's funeral, but one that still carried the weight of a man who owned the ground beneath his feet. Beside me, Beatrice checked her leather briefcase, her face a mask of professional ice. We watched through the glass partition as Lillian and Jeffrey sat opposite a young, hopeful couple, Dr. Stephen Evans and his pregnant wife, Rebecca. On the mahogany table between them sat a cashier's check for $1,800,000, representing the buyer's entire future and a massive mortgage. Lillian was radiant in a structured black power suit, her hair pulled into a severe, elegant bun that screamed success. She was leaning forward, her voice dripping with practiced empathy, as she handed a silver pen to Dr. Evans. "My father is resting comfortably at a private facility on the mainland," she lied smoothly, her eyes never wavering. "He's so happy this house is going to a young family who will cherish the gardens he spent 30 years cultivating. He just wants to know his legacy is in good hands before his time is up." Jeffrey was vibrating with a nervous, manic energy, his hand reflexively dabbing at a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He kept checking his Rolex every 30 seconds, his eyes darting toward the grandfather clock in the corner. He wasn't seeing a home being sold. He was seeing a pile of chips on a poker table, and he was seconds away from cashing out. "The wire transfer instructions are all set, Stephen," Jeffrey chimed in, his voice thin and high. "As soon as Arthur signs the final disclosure, we can wrap this up and get you the keys by noon." I didn't wait for an invitation. I pushed the heavy double doors open, the sound of the latch clicking like a gunshot in the silent room. Every head turned. Lillian's mouth fell open, her silver pen clattering onto the hardwood floor as she stared at me as if I were a ghost rising from the Atlantic. Jeffrey's face turned a sickly shade of gray, his legs stopping its frantic bouncing as he gripped the edge of the table. I didn't look at them. I walked straight to the head of the table and took the high-backed leather chair that the title agent had reserved for the owner. "I apologize for the delay, Dr. Evans, Rebecca," I said, my voice deep and resonant, filling the room with the authority I had wielded for 40 years. "I'm Arthur Vance, and I'm afraid there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding the availability of this property." "Dad, what are you doing?" Lillian hissed, her voice sharp with a rising hysteria as she tried to stand up. "You're confused. The medication. You're having an episode. Jeffrey, call the car. We need to get him back to the facility immediately." "Sit down, Lillian," I commanded, the cold steel in my tone pinning her to her seat. I turned back to the young couple, who were now clutching their check as if it were contaminated. "I want to thank you for your interest in my home, but this estate is not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, and certainly not by the two individuals sitting across from you who have no legal right to even be in this building." Beatrice stepped forward, placing a thick stack of certified documents onto the mahogany table with a thud that echoed off the glass walls. "My name is Beatrice Thorne, and I represent the Eleanor Vance Memorial Trust," she announced to the room. "The deed you are attempting to transfer is legally void, and more importantly, my client is here to discuss a much more pressing matter, a $2,400,000 debt that is now due in full immediately." The air in the conference room became heavy with the scent of ozone and cold sweat as Beatrice spread the forensic audit across the table. Jeffrey reached for the pitcher of water, his hand shaking so violently that the ice clinked like a death knell against the crystal. "This is a private family matter," he stammered, his voice cracking as he looked toward the door. "Gerald, we were just trying to protect your assets. We have a legal power of attorney. You had a fiduciary duty, Jeffrey, which you breached the moment you transferred the title to your shell company for $10. Beatrice countered, her voice as sharp as a razor. She slid a document toward the title agent, who was already backing away from the table. "This is the quitclaim deed Jeffrey signed last week. It purports to transfer the property from Arthur Vance, the individual. However, Arthur Vance, the individual, does not own this estate. The Eleanor Vance Memorial Trust has held the title for 10 years. You cannot sell what you do not own." Lillian jumped to her feet, her structured suit jacket bunching at the shoulders as her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You're an old man, Dad. You're sick. You don't know what's best for you anymore," she shrieked, her composure finally shattering like glass. "We need that money. We already signed the lease in Paris. You're ruining everything over a pile of old bricks." "I'm not ruining your life, Lillian. You did that yourselves when you decided to treat your father like a line item in a budget," I said, my voice low and steady. I pulled my smartphone from my pocket and laid it on the mahogany table, pressing play on the recording I had made in the workshop. The room filled with her own voice, cold and clinical, discussing how I was an obstacle and how they would abandon me in a county ward once the wire transfer cleared. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. Dr. Evans and Rebecca had already fled the room, their check clutched tightly in their hands as they escaped the wreckage of my family. Jeffrey slumped back into his chair, his eyes fixed on the promissory note for $2,400,000 that I now controlled. He realized that I didn't just save the house. I held the leash to his very existence. I bought your debt from Harborside Capital this morning, Jeffrey, I said, leaning in until I could see the terror in his pupils. Every cent you borrowed to cover your crypto losses is now owed to me. And since the note is callable upon demand in the event of a criminal investigation, I am calling it now. Pay me $2,400,000 by noon, or I begin the seizure of every asset you have left, including your cars, your clothes, and your freedom. Dad, please, Lillian whimpered, her legs giving out as she sank back into her chair. We can fix this. We can go back to the way things were. There is no way back, Lillian, I said, standing up and buttoning my charcoal jacket. I nodded toward the double doors, which swung open to reveal Detective Miller and his partner. They weren't in uniform, but the glint of the badges on their belts was unmistakable. Lillian Vance and Jeffrey Dunn? Detective Miller asked, his voice echoing through the opulent office. You are under arrest for first-degree wire fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. You have the right to remain silent. The sound of the steel handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful sound I had heard in 30 years. It was mechanical, cold, and final. As the detectives led them toward the elevator, Lillian screamed my name, a high-pitched, desperate sound that didn't move me an inch. I turned my back on them and looked out at the harbor, watching the ferry disappear into the horizon. They wanted me to be a ghost, but as I stood in the silence of the room, I knew I was finally the master of my own house again. 6 months after the steel doors of the county jail slammed shut behind Lillian and Jeffrey, I stood on the edge of the Gayhead Cliffs, watching the Atlantic tide erode the ancient clay. The island was quiet now, the summer tourists replaced by a crisp, biting wind that felt cleaner than any air I had breathed in decades. I had spent the last half-year systematically dismantling the empire I had built, not out of defeat, but for the ultimate purification. I didn't want the house on Dearborn Street anymore. The memories of my daughter's laughter in those halls had been poisoned by the recording of her plotting my demise. I sold the estate to a local conservation land bank for a symbolic sum, ensuring that no luck. Jeffrey's bankruptcy was total and humiliating. I exercised my rights as his primary creditor to seize every asset he had tried to hide. I sold his fleet of luxury cars, his offshore accounts, and even the diamond earrings he had bought Lillian with my stolen dividends. Every cent recovered from their greed went directly into the Eleanor Vance Memorial Trust, which now provides full tuition scholarships for young engineers who want to build the future rather than steal it. Lillian's reputation in the Massachusetts real estate market was incinerated. She was blacklisted from every professional board in the state, a pariah in the world she once tried so hard to dominate. My phone, resting on the weathered wooden bench beside me, began to vibrate with a persistent, rhythmic hum. I looked down at the notification. Incoming call from Dukes County Correctional Facility. I watched the screen glow for a full minute as it rang, then stopped, then started again. It was the 49th time Lillian had tried to reach me this week. I knew what she wanted. She wanted me to pay for a private defense attorney. She wanted to apologize for the misunderstanding. She wanted the father she had tried to throw in the trash to bail her out one last time. I didn't block the number. Blocking it would be an act of emotion, a sign that her existence still required a reaction from me. Instead, I simply turned the phone face down on the bench. Ignoring her was an act of absolute power, a declaration that she was no longer a variable in the equation of my life. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, silver compass that belonged to Eleanor. I looked at the needle, steady and true, pointing toward a horizon they would never see. I am Arthur Vance. I am 73 years old. My lungs are clear, and my soul is finally at peace. I built the piers that protect this island, but the strongest foundation I ever laid was the one I stood on today, the truth. They tried to tell me my place was in the trash, but they forgot that a man who knows how to build can always tear down the walls of a prison he didn't belong in. I took one last breath of the salty air, stood up, and walked toward the ferry. I wasn't looking for a family anymore. I was looking for the rest of my life.